So, Doki Doki is another season that has something of a reputation. While I do my best to avoid spoilers as I'm working my way through all of Precure, it is somewhat unavoidable that people mention things offhandedly or that I see something that will end up letting me know something ahead of time. It happens, and I can't even be mad about it. This series has been running for over 20 years now, and I can't expect that people are going to avoid talking about spoilers just because I haven't seen the whole thing yet. I don't try to run into them, but there are things that I can pick up on the vibe of even if I haven't been fully spoiled. For example, I got the impression very early on that Doki Doki is something of a controversial season that people either really love or really don't. I heard a few mumbles about some of the more particular reasons for that, but I wasn't ever really sure how I would end up feeling about things. What fascinated me most, though, was that I had heard that this was one of the more serialized seasons, something that Precure tends to mostly avoid doing in my experience. And it was funny that a season like that would come directly after a season that was perhaps the most episodic that the series had ever been. I was curious, as someone who enjoys serialized storytelling, how this would turn out. Was that something that would even work with Precure, where serialization is usually just used for big multi episode finale blowouts and then maybe a few other two-parters here and there? I'd heard concerning things about one or two of the characters, and I knew there was some sort of big thing in the middle of the season that got people upset, though the specifics eluded me. Either way, I knew I was in for a ride, and by the end, I ended up being pretty mixed about the whole affair. So let's stop wasting time and get right into talking about the characters, since they really were the highlight of this season. So, in preparing to make this video and in having watched the season myself, I have gathered that Mana, our pink lead Cure Heart, is perhaps the most divisive character this season. And if I take a step back and look at things as a whole, I think I can understand why. She is very different than most of the other pink leads that have come before her. Mana is exceptionally capable, even when compared to other characters who have fulfilled the role of student council president in their seasons. She's smart, driven, and quite attuned to the needs of those around her. She's talented in a variety of things, sometimes seeming to be almost effortlessly able to do anything she puts her mind to. And while that might make her something of a good role model to children, it does also make her something that's a little bit of a problem for a lead of a season. Mana is a little boring. Now, she's not the most boring character that Precure's ever had or anything like that, but she is lacking a certain something that makes her as fun to watch as some of the other leads. While Mana does have flaws, they're not as immediately evident, and they're also not quite as obvious and spelled out as they have been for some past characters. Meaning that if you're not paying attention, you could end up overlooking them entirely and end up thinking that the show presents her as being perfect. Just a little bit of looking will lead you to find that there is no shortage of people who are all too willing and ready to mark Mana down as being a Mary Sue, and that was something that really gave me pause because I've been around the block enough in fandom circles to know that the idea of a character being a Mary Sue is something that we really have to give a critical look to. This is one of those things where a term got thrown around and distorted enough that people were laying this title on characters left and right who by no means should have actually been considered one. As a result, I'd like to take a little bit of a detour to quickly talk about the origins of this term and what it really means so that we can all be on the same page about that before we get to putting Mana on trial. So indulge me for a second here, even if you think you already know the definition of a Mary Sue. And if you want a longer discussion on the Sue, I highly recommend Overly Sarcastic Productions' Trope Talk video on the subject. You see, the Mary Sue is something that originated from fan fiction spaces, like old fan fiction spaces. Way back in the day, Star Trek spawned a fan base so large and active that it would very much go on to shape the future of what we know as fandom and what it looks like today. Even before widespread adoption of the internet, these Trekkie fan spaces were connecting up with each other and sharing their own creative work through collaborative projects like zines. Yes, you could literally have fan fiction, fan art, fan essays, and all sorts of other content mailed to you by people you gave your address as a method of distribution. Wild times. Eventually, there were some recurring trends in fan works, though, that people started to notice. Before the term Mary Sue even existed, there were characters that were falling into the mold that would eventually be defined. This is what led Paula Smith to write a short parody piece titled A Trekkie's Tale. It's short, only a handful of paragraphs with only a few sentences of dialogue. If you want, you can go and give the thing a read for yourself. It's actually pretty easy to find. The main character of this piece was, you guessed it, Mary Sue, the youngest ever lieutenant of the fleet at only 15 and a half. She's the perfect everything, and everyone loves her until she dies really tragically young with all the major characters crying at her side. Mary Sue was created as a reaction to a recurring type of character that was showing up in fanworks even back in the 70s. Even back then, young authors were wanting to write themselves into the stories they love and wanted characters to like them when they did. As an escape, they might have written themselves as being very capable or being young and lacking deeper writing experience. Yeah, some of those creatives might have missed the mark on telling a compelling story. It's not really anything to get all that worked up about, but in a time where space in these zines was a limited commodity, I can understand being frustrated to see these stories instead of something that was more compelling, even if both are ultimately a showing of love towards a piece of media. When you're coming to a fanwork to read about certain characters, having a story contain a new character that has made everything all about them, that can be really frustrating. This is certainly expressed in the parody, where there's only a singular sentence that does not mention or relate to Mary Sue, the sentence being the short, "Mr. Spock came onto the bridge." So this short parody piece is written and spreads around enough that people are starting to clock these sorts of characters as Mary Sues in reference to the parody. It was very much a term that was made and used for fanfiction and fandom spaces for a specific fanfiction archetype, but eventually it breached containment and got warped into shorthand for character who is more capable than I think they should be, or character that doesn't have flaws or has weak flaws like being clumsy. Or female character that I don't like, but I need a justification to not like her so people don't point out that I just don't like that she's a girl. See the problem? So what is a Mary Sue really, even if we remove her from her fanfiction roots? Put simply, a Mary Sue is a character who sort of warps the world of a story to the point that everything about it relates to her and supports her. And to be clear, this can happen with both male and female characters, but because the trope name is Mary Sue, I'm going to use her for this. There is no element of the story that is not about the Sue. Every character is relevant because of how they relate to the Sue, and the plot exists solely for the sake of the Sue. It's not just about being perfect, but about making the story exactly and precisely all about this character to the detriment of other elements of the story. And looking at things from that framework, I don't think that Mana really makes the cut for being a true Mary Sue. Does she have a higher importance than some past Precure leads? Yes. Does she have less overt and obvious flaws? Yes. However, she does not warp the world around her. Not everything relates back to Mana, and there's not any point where she really breaks the rules of the world. No more than any other Precure lead has, anyway. Not to mention, the idea of thinking a character is overpowered in Precure of all places is pretty funny. Sure, our girls get beaten down now and then, but Precure is something of a feminine power fantasy where everything can be overcome with your friends at your sides. Concerning yourself with how weak or strong characters are isn't really something to get all too fussed about in a show that rarely defines any rules of its magic system. Am I surprised that this sentiment has flourished in regards to Mana? No, not really, because after you're done watching a show and have put it in the rearview mirror, your memories of it tend to sort of get flattened and smoothed out into a more simplified form in your long-term memory. If you didn't care much for Mana, when your long-term memory of the season kicks in, you're mostly going to remember the broad strokes more readily than the little details. But really, I think a lot of the sentiment is more Doki Doki focuses more on Mana than most other seasons do for their lead, rendering her more capable than other pink leads and putting what flaws she does have on display less, and I don't care for that. That gets flattened down to Mana feels like she has more screen time and importance than other characters and is perfect. And that gets flattened down to Mana is a Mary Sue. And she's not. Mana does get put more front and center in the show and is given more focus when it comes to the team dynamic and the magical side of the lives of these characters, But she's definitely not perfect, and there are points where even her friends do consider her to be an active hindrance to the mission they have. While she's capable of a great many things, what she's able to do does not feel, to me at least, to be outside the realm of a very driven teenage girl. She's not Superwoman. Much of what she's capable of appears to be an extension of her conflict resolution skills and a lot of preparation on her part. Could they have showed that preparation more? Probably, but Precure is a series that has limited screen time, so I'm not surprised they chose to cut that and maybe just mention it offhand now and then. Mana is mostly just displayed as being very good with people and very, very driven. She very much strikes me as being a jack of all trades but master of none. For all that we see Mana doing for others, we rarely see her doing all that much for herself, and she doesn't appear to have very many personal passions or hobbies. I know she likes Makoto's music and that she wants to be a prime minister someday, which, given the exceptionally wide gender gap in Japanese politics, I really hope you do, sweetie, but I don't really have that much hope for you on that front. We do see Mana doing a lot of things, but she's not deeply involved in anything outside of her student council work. Mana is displayed as being very selfless and going out of her way to help others quite a bit, but this isn't always portrayed as an entirely good thing. There are points where it is shown that this is something that can be a detriment to Mana, and she has a tendency to overwork herself. I wish we could have gotten more of that, but it is there. There's a pretty consistent line drawn between Mana and this story of the Happy Prince, a character who spends his fairy tale giving away bits of himself until there is nothing left. However, despite Mana sometimes spreading herself a little too thin, I don't ever think we reach the point where it's a completely apt comparison. Part of that comes down to the other characters intervening before it truly gets to that point, and Mana being willing to ask for help and fall back on her friends, but it does mean that the downsides of this behavior don't exactly get put on display enough to be recognizable as a flaw. I'm not saying it needed to happen constantly, but it would have been good to at least see it once a quarter to really put it in perspective. It wouldn't even have to be in her personal life. It could have been on the magic side of things, perhaps a little too much willingness to self-sacrifice, for example. It's there, but I would have liked to see it actually come up more in practice, given how this idea of Mana as the Happy Prince comes up multiple times. Mana's other flaw is one I'm not sure the narrative really grappled with all that much. You see, Mana has this tendency to be a little too trusting of those she perhaps shouldn't be, and also to not be able to let go when something turns someone against her. This obviously centers mostly around the character of Regina, who we'll get into later. Regina is presented as being on the villainous side from the start, and Mana does end up really taking her at face value and trying to make friends with her when logically that's something that's actually a pretty bad idea. It ends up working out for a while, and then things go south very fast. We will get to it later. And Mana is unwilling to let go of this prior friendship, even when it's been sort of torn to shreds. This makes her someone that other characters leave out of their plans when it comes to dealing with Regina because of a philosophical difference in how she should be handled, and the view that Mana would literally just get in the way of them doing what, from their perspective, needs to be done. They know that Mana is going to want to talk things out and fix things that don't seem like they can ever be fixed. They recognize just how damn stubborn she is when it comes to matters of friendship and her lack of willingness to consider the worst case scenario in this blind spot that she has. It's just a shame that because of the genre we're in, Mana ends up being in the right, and things do eventually get patched up when she does interfere. I mean, it's a bit of a windy road to get there, but it does happen. This trusting blind spot of Mana's is something that the show definitely could have interrogated more and dealt with as more of a flaw. There are a few points where the whole crew gets duped, and perhaps this flaw of hers could be made more obvious if the others were a little bit more skeptical and Mana was the only one who didn't question things for a moment. Play a little more into that early season, very blasé attitude she had about the magic stuff. Then turn it around and turn it into a strength of hers of being able to reach out to those who have hurt her. Perhaps the biggest issue, though, is that Mana herself doesn't really have an arc. She starts and ends the season as pretty much the same person, but with a few extra friends and having had some magical adventures. While the season puts a lot of magical physical obstacles in her way, it doesn't really do that much to give her personal emotional struggles to overcome or challenge her philosophy as a person. While there was room to do that with her relationship with Regina because of the genre convention that friendship is a good thing and you should keep reaching out to your friends, there's not a lot that plotline does to challenge Mana personally. One of the most compelling moments is when Mana breaks down crying in the wake of a defeat, only to slap herself in the face to pick herself back up again and keep moving forward. It's a moment that sort of lives as an echo of a breakdown after Regina very suddenly turns on her in the middle of the season. In one instance, it was a devastating blow that she clearly needed time to sit and process, given that it was a big loss, and in the other, she does manage to pick herself up and turn things around pretty quickly. I can see where the moment of growth is meant to be there, but it just doesn't fully coalesce and is something that's more visible in hindsight rather than feeling like a deliberate evolution when you're watching it. I think that there are more interesting things that could have been done with Mana and just weren't because they tried taking a different direction than usual with the lead. I'm not opposed to her being a sort of figure for little kids to look up to, but I do wish there was a little bit more of her to give me something to latch onto, since I just ended up finding her kind of boring, even if I do think the perception she ended up getting is a little unfair. Rika is so much fun and may be one of my favorite characters this season. At first glance, she does seem to mostly just be there to be Mana's support system, but as we get to know her and her passions, I really ended up falling in love with her. I think it all started when she didn't immediately end up becoming a Precure once she found out they were a thing because Mana couldn't keep a secret from her. That one episode of delay in showing us that she was willing to help out even if she didn't have magic powers of her own does a lot to characterize Rika as someone who watches out for other people. We see her being the one that sort of has her finger on the pulse of how the group is doing as a whole and being able to predict who needs support, something that does keep Mana from falling into any of those pitfalls. She serves a vital purpose in the group dynamic. However, it's when we get to see her on her own that I find her more interesting. Rika has this nice little through line of figuring out what it even is she wants to do with her life. And that's not something new for a Precure girl, since these are so often coming-of-age stories, but Rika's variation is unique because of the point she's starting that journey from. At the start of the series, it's well established that Rika wants to be a doctor, and she's already functioning pretty independently since her parents are often very busy with their work. Rika is pretty self-sufficient and self-assured. She knows what she wants, and she is pursuing it. Which is why when she finds an interest in a new hobby, playing Karuta, it's something that is seemingly actually somewhat distressing to her. While she has picked up doing Precure stuff on top of her studies, that's something that is protecting and helping people, so it's kind of a no-brainer to add it to her plate. Karuta, though, that's for personal pleasure, and thus feels like a selfish thing to pursue rather than something that will immediately or eventually benefit other people. That's something she has to reckon with, and I like the conclusion we get with that. Rika does continue on with Karuta and is supported by everyone around her to do so. You see, in a show like this, it can be easy to assign characters their one specified hobby, goal, or interest and then focus everything around that one thing. In reality, though, people are multifaceted and have multiple interests. It's good to have a character who branches out and tries something new that they eventually end up falling in love with. Gaining an interest in Karuta does not mean that Rika stops caring about being a doctor. It just means she has a new thing to juggle in her schedule, and that's okay. The biggest drawback to Rika's new interest is that with a potential match against a high-level player, she allowed herself to neglect her studies and other parts of her life that needed paying attention to. There could have been a little bit more about her finding that balance in terms of how much she wanted to devote to personal short-term pursuits versus her long-term goals, but the core of the episode was really about her feeling that she needed to hide her new interest from those around her or face their scolding, so I understand why that element ended up being more understated in comparison. My only gripe is that we don't get anything more of this other than a light mention or two. We don't see Rika play again. It might have been nice to have an episode that followed up on that, given that this season seemingly tried to hold on to more continuity or serialization than other seasons. So Rika learns she can have more than one interest, and eventually that leads her to reflecting on the goals that she already has. She wanted to be a doctor, or so she thought. There's this episode where Rika sort of interrogates her own goals. She definitely really looks up to her parents, even if she can get a little exasperated by how busy they are at times. However, she does have to reckon with the fact that her mother is a huge inspiration towards her. Does she want to be a doctor because it's what she wants, or because she wants to emulate her mother and follow in her footsteps? It's a big question, and while not one she has to fully decide on right now, it's an important thing for her to consider since at this point in her life she's really developing her autonomy and sense of self. She's growing up, and these are the questions that she needs to start asking herself. What I especially love is that she does still decide she wants to be a doctor at the end of the day. Sometimes it's perfectly fine to interrogate your own feelings or plans and come down feeling the same way as you did before. It's perfectly valid to question something about yourself and come to the conclusion that that aspect is already right for you and you don't need to upend a part of yourself. Obviously, that's not okay in every case, but sometimes you just end up better understanding why you feel a certain way. Self reflection is an important process. It's also a really nice development for her that while she decides she still wants to be a doctor, it's now out of her personal desire to help people as well, rather than just being about following in her mother's footsteps. Same conclusion, but by a different route that's more core to her as a person rather than being a reflection of someone else. Honestly, the biggest downside to Rika as a character is that a lot of her solo content is front loaded in the series. I think there was still more room to explore her, but much of the latter half of the season has her content fall into more being part of the group dynamic rather than focusing in on her in specific, which does feel like a little bit of a loss. It's not like she has completely faded into the background like has been the fate of some characters, but more that she's usually paired up with someone else and doesn't get the chance to really shine as the star of the show anymore, which I ended up missing, especially in some of the slower sections of the season. I am a little bit torn when it comes to Alice. On one hand, she is an endlessly entertaining character with the amount of gags that her affluence allows the story to pull off, but on the other, a good portion of the interesting stories about her are things from the past, not the present. There are a few moments where we get to see her doing things in the present, but it can often feel like she is implementing something she has already learned rather than learning something in the moment. This isn't a bad thing and is once again a place where a character can be a good example to kids, but at the same time, it does end up making Alice's focal episodes a little less interesting and makes her feel like a bit more static of a character. That said, there were some interesting concepts built into her that I would love to maybe see the series circle back around to someday. The idea that Alice is a character who is already proficient in combat, enough so to be able to take on people twice her size even without the boost that magic powers gives her, is a pretty fun concept already, but the way that this is then not just used as a gag but actually worked into her character and worldview is what elevates it. She has that strength and capability, but when she was a kid, she had to learn the limits of her own strength and reckon with the fact that she has the capability to really hurt someone if she isn't careful. For a series that is so often about teenage girls throwing hands with monsters, having a character that is aware of the damage they could do to someone is a nice angle to approach things from. One of Alice's best episodes is her introduction because it has her grappling with this, knowing she would love to help, but not wanting to lose control of herself. That is a risk she isn't really willing to take, but she eventually does because she wants to help and protect the people that she cares about. And hey, she even gets a shield, letting her serve as a shield to others without having to do anything as outright offensive as they are able to. And let's be real, given her current capabilities, giving her something actually offensive might have let her kill God like a JRPG protagonist. So even then, I appreciate that this time we let a character that has a shield use it a little more creatively. Most of the time, the shield character doesn't really get to do all that much except jump in front of others and pop the shield for a bit, which can leave them a little boring in combat. Alice does do that a decent amount, sure, but there are also points where she does some shield bash techniques and send her shield flying like a projectile in order to get a ranged hit in or send someone flying on it. It gives her a sense of being more resourceful and flexible as a result. Alice also has a rivalry with another rich girl, one that is one of those cases where Alice has grown up enough to be good-natured about it and the other girl is still being a little petulant, which makes for a fun dynamic. It does mean we're in the realm of seeing Alice show her growth and self-control off instead of truly growing in these situations, but it's still something and allows her to solidify that growth. That said, though, I do wish we could have seen it more since it only shows up in like 2 episodes. And part of that might be that we just don't see Alice in as many casual settings as the other girls since she doesn't go to school with them, which does strike me as odd. She was shown to go to school with them in the past, but that's not the case now. There's a shot that shows her in a different school uniform at one point, which implies she goes to a different school, but we're never really shown her at this other school. I know the idea is that she's mostly at home handling family business and all, and that she's in a different tax bracket so she could afford a different school, but her absence is particularly notable once the series bends over backwards to get pop idol Makoto into class with Mana and Rika, given that she has a whole entertainment career going on outside of school. I understand that it's somewhat being done as a character thing and as a way to really distinguish the position Alice is in compared to the others, but at the same time, it does cut out a lot of the time she could be spending with them to give her basic characterization. There are scenes where she's just straight up the only one on the team that isn't present. She might not have added much to the conversations, sure, but just having her there and reacting can sometimes be a way to give someone characterization. And those are opportunities that Alice just doesn't get. Like, I know it can sometimes be mighty convenient that everyone goes to the same school or is in the same class, but it is for a reason, giving them a place to easily meet up without having to come up with external plans. I like Alice, but I feel like she's a character I could have come to love with just a few adjustments. And I suppose the other thing to talk about with Alice is the way the series uses her absurd wealth for jokes. I'm a bit mixed on this. It's one of those types of humor where it's going to be really hit or miss for me depending on the day. Sometimes when I was watching, I was amused, and others I was just kind of rolling my eyes. Now, there have been some characters in the past with Precure that have had a sort of quietly implied wealth. Karen was perhaps the most overt up to this point, but with the rest, you could tell who lived in apartments and who lived in pretty sprawling houses. It just wasn't something that was really brought up. Nobody is pinching pennies, but nobody's usually acting like money is no object either. So Alice kind of comes out of nowhere with the kind of wealth that's straight up Seto Kaiba cartoonish. Karen's family had summer homes. Alice has a personal spaceship. There are a few times where Alice being rich as hell is a helpful little thing. For example, getting girls into places because her family owns them, I'm perfectly fine with, since it's like a key opening a door and not much beyond that. Same thing for when they have to do a bit of travel. Sure, put that on Dad's gold card. However, when you have times where Alice whips out the analysis machine to tell them how a magic thing works, or uses her money as a sort of fix everything button, I do find myself sort of longing for a more creative solution, as I see the writers using it to write around having to deal with something. The comedic displays around that are something that help, but it doesn't mean that they keep me from spotting the times where her money is sort of just used as a get-out-of-jail-free card. I'm fine with it as a once-in-a-while type of character, but if this becomes a repeated archetype, I'm probably going to develop more of a problem with it. I really like Makoto, I just have problems with some of the things surrounding her as all. As a character, having someone who's a bit on edge and guarded without being outright edgy is an archetype that I really appreciate. I also enjoy when we have a team of newbies having to work with someone with experience. Makoto is a character who has a palpable sense of background within the world that this season sets up. She sees herself as having failed and is trying to rectify the mistakes of the past while also not sure where she can even begin to do that. Her sense of dedication is admirable, and it is clear just how much agency she's gained for herself by getting into a position that allows her to be pretty mobile to do what she needs to do. I appreciate having a character who is so pragmatic and straightforward. I also love that she's kind of funny. She gets to play the fish out of water role as someone who hasn't really lived in this world that long. And I love that she is able to be put off by the idea of befriending someone who is on the enemy's side. While the rest of the group shows their reservations, Makoto is the one who has a pretty hardline stance on this initially, because she's the one that's seen the most what the enemy is capable of and the level of destruction that they can bring raining down on their heads. In short, Makoto is the one who is making her decisions based on trauma this season, taking actions in response to getting hurt, but also to avoid getting hurt again in the future. So just seeing her open up to those around her, soften and settle, is a nice development to watch unfold over the course of the season. If that had been everything I was provided, I think I would have had a pretty great time, but then the series had to go and mix it up by layering the whole idol thing on top of Makoto. So I didn't expect to be talking about idols so soon, but here we are again. You can hear more about my reservations on the whole idol thing by going and taking a look at this video. It's mostly a recap about all the Magical Girl anime that came out last year, but in the end, I run down the stuff that is upcoming. Part of that being the idol-themed season of Precure that is currently running at this time, but hadn't yet started when I made that video. The long and the short of it is that I don't really get the whole idol thing. It's not something that's ever appealed to me, and I doubt it ever really will, even though from the outside there are some things I can kind of see and understand liking about all of that. My concern lies mainly with the idea of promoting idols as an appealing future to little girls uncritically. I had the same misgivings with the way that Miki's modeling was handled in Fresh. I recognize these shows as being akin to a form of play for kids, but that is something that always gets me a little on the defensive and unsure when I see it being laid out without showing any of the drawbacks, you know? So I'm not exactly thrilled with the way that this is handled with Makoto, but I will admit it's more even-handed than I initially expected the series would be. Makoto is shown to be kept extremely busy and having to dedicate a lot of time and effort to this work. We do see some other people in her field be less than perfectly kind to her, either to her face or behind her back. There is even another girl that demonstrates just how these idols are pitted against each other for competition for both airtime and fan attention. That's good stuff. However, there are some missteps. When Makoto is shown being tired, it's implied more to be from her patrolling the city as a Precure on top of everything else, rather than being worn down from her work. And I think that given the highly packed schedule we're shown she has, there could have been at least a token mention or two of how that's a lot for her to deal with on its own. In particular, I do not like the approach the show takes to matters of Makoto's privacy. There's a scene in the episode where Makoto starts attending school where a bunch of her superfans show up in front of the school to ward off any paparazzi that might want to bother her in her new environment. While I understand the sentiment they're going for, there is a seeming willful ignorance of the fact that they are invading her privacy just as much. Which, yeah, that is something I could genuinely see being an issue for fans at that scale. The sort of blindness to how you are replicating malicious behaviors because in your mind, there's no malicious intent, so it's not the same. However, the series doesn't really point this out and has them told off more for being a disruption to others rather than the way that they are invading Makoto's privacy just as much, if not more, by appointing themselves as this sort of protection squad and showing up at the unpublicized location of her school. All of this is made a little more unsettling by the way that this group is depicted as all being grown men. Makoto seems to have a wide-ranging fan base in general, but this possessive and protective group is all grown men reacting this way to a teenager. Realistic, perhaps, but that does not change the way that it unsettles me that this isn't something that's ever actually addressed in a meaningful manner. I don't think these fans even show up again after this episode. In general, I think the way that Makoto's idol career is handled is pretty grounded. She's not doing crazy fantastical things. It's mostly the down-to-earth work that you would expect out of an idol in real life. Her costumes are realistic, and it's not like she's doing magic or anything like that as part of her shows or singing, but the ways that it's treated like something in the background of her life and not something that takes up most of her time just ends up feeling disingenuous to me. The biggest hang-up I have with it, though, is the way it causes the series to treat the prospect of her quitting. So, from the start, it is established that the whole reason Makoto was singing like this was to get herself into a visible position in the world so that if the Princess of the Magic Kingdom of this season also landed there, she would be able to see Makoto and come and find her. Her singing career was mostly just a means to an end, even if it could, at times, give her something of a creative outlet. So once she ends up having found that princess, it's only natural that she might start floating the idea of her retirement from her idol career. It's a pretty natural progression for her to take, but everyone else seems to be really upset that she might do this. And that bothered me because whenever the rest of the cast talked about Makoto quitting, it was never focused on how Makoto felt or how much she had to work. It was all about how much they would miss her singing and how she would be letting down her fans. That didn't sit right with me because it ends up making her friends come off as really selfish. Oh hey, selfishness and selflessness are a pretty core element of the season, so are we going to point out that behavior and the way that they're being selfish by only considering their wants and not their friends' feelings? No, actually, Makoto's going to talk to the spirit of the princess in a magic mirror and get re-encouraged to keep up her idol career. And here's the thing, a lot of my problem with this comes down to the way that Makoto's singing has been framed up to this point and the way that the show is choosing to treat her ending her career. There are some tweaks that could have made this work, but because these two things are slamming against each other in a grating way, it just doesn't. From the start, not only was Makoto singing something that was a means to an end, but it was also treated as something she did for a particular person. We'll get into the queerness of this season later on, but suffice to say, Makoto is written in a way that implies she has more than just friendly feelings for the princess. She is shown to have sung on stage in the past, and even then it's framed as her not really caring about the whole audience. She only wanted to sing for the princess, and if this was what she had to do that, so be it. She sang because it made the princess happy, and doing that made her happy. She seemed to enjoy singing, but even if it was in front of an audience, to her, there was only an audience of one. So Makoto not really caring about having anyone listening to her does track, and perhaps if this was an episode where she came to appreciate the rest of the people who had listened to her and loved her singing, it might feel different. But because of the way her own relationship with singing was handled and how it's been so much of a means to an end for her, I don't love this seeming insistence that she needs to keep up her singing career despite how much it puts on her shoulders. As far as I'm concerned, the only benefit to her keeping her singing career going is an awesome scene in a later episode where she sings while walking through the middle of the fight in order to reach someone. And to be fair, this might just be a case where I have philosophical differences from the series. I tend to come at things from the angle that even if her singing makes people happy, that does not mean she is obligated to keep doing so just to please them. Meanwhile, the series seems to be running with the idea that because Makoto's singing is a good in the life of the people around her, she should keep doing it for their sake. Because she likes singing, so why not make other people happy with it? Now, this was all spurred on by someone commenting that they didn't feel any love from her singing, so her rediscovering that element of singing might have been another angle that this could have been taken with, without the strange way that everyone kept pressuring her to do something she said she didn't want to do. It's really the way that nobody actually seems to listen to anything she is saying and have an actual conversation with her about it without injecting their wants that really bothers me. Also, the way that Makoto quitting singing is framed bothers me even more. I have a real pet peeve for when a piece of media has a character state that they are quitting something that is a goal or a career, but then also acts like that means they are giving up any possible casual enjoyment of the same thing as well. Everyone acts as though Makoto quitting being an idol means she will never sing again, including Makoto. I understand this is to make it feel like it has higher stakes than it actually does, but it just makes everything feel completely melodramatic and overblown. That it is not even mentioned that Makoto could continue to sing casually or for her own enjoyment feels really off. Though I suspect if they had done that, it might have made her friends who were still pushing for her to sing seem even more selfish than they might already come off. I admit that I might be coming down harder on this because I don't exactly rub up well against idol culture, but I do think the handling of Makoto's career is something that's a little bit of a detriment to a character that already had some interesting avenues to explore in terms of her trauma and the way it causes her to be defensive, overcoming the damage it's left her with, and learning to love again. The idol thing honestly seems like it was almost tacked onto her character in order to sell a microphone headset toy outside of a few episodes that really focus in on it. The episodes that focused on Makoto and her relationship to her career were ones that I personally found to be weaker, so I end up feeling that her screen time could have been better utilized. We kind of have to talk about Regina and Augury at the same time because they, remember I warned you about spoilers at the top of the video, end up being two halves of the same person, and because the problems about them in the narrative are kind of intertwined. Regina is one of the villains of the season, and she ends up coming in a handful of episodes into the series. She isn't there from the start, but she is so much there once she does arrive and has a big personality that she is instantly very eye-catching. One of the most notable things is that she very immediately forms an attachment to and interest in Mana. Mana, being the way she is about being very open to everyone, does her best to be her friend. At this point, Regina is very driven by her own desires. Whatever she thinks is important and matters to her is important and matters, no matter what anyone else might have to say about it. She is incredibly self-centered. And while that certainly is a character flaw, it's displayed in a way that's really fun and not annoying, while also giving a very clear place for her to grow from. While she might be a character that is incredibly selfish, she is also depicted as being willing to learn and grow, which is important. A willingness to try and attempts to do so can often really save a character that might have otherwise been insufferable. Not that that's really a problem with Regina, because the way she is portrayed is just so fun, lively, and energetic that she doesn't really have a chance to be annoying. While she might be a character that is incredibly selfish, she's a lot of fun, and it's clear that she doesn't really understand why what she's doing is wrong. And that leads to some great comedy when her solutions to what she sees as a problem are drastically out of proportion to what the problem actually is. Like wanting to get rid of Mana's school, because if the school is gone, then Mana would be able to play with her right now instead of later like she wants. I've gotten the impression that Regina was at the time, and probably still is, a pretty popular character, and I can definitely see why, because she is very entertaining to watch. However, the show takes the next step and starts to move its way into an arc for her to really and truly grow. She starts making friends with the main characters, and through that starts to correct her behavior and become a bit of a better person, to the point where she even stands up against her father. Oh, yeah, I might have forgotten to mention, but Regina's father is the main villain of the season. He's the big, bad, shadowy, evil king in the distance that we're trying to fight. So the moment she turns on her father and sides with her friends is a huge movement for her, and it is treated with the gravity that it deserves. It feels like something of a turning point. The closest thing I could compare it to would be when Setsuna turned around in Fresh. There are even moments that lay the groundwork for Regina potentially starting to live with Mana. The show is very much angling like she's going to be the next one to join the team, or at the very least exist as a persistent ally, even if she's not specifically a cure. And just as you're starting to feel secure in that possibility, the show rips it away from you and throws it on the ground as though you were a fool for getting your hopes up in the first place. Leading up to this point, there are a few spots where Regina seems to struggle with the whole being a decent person thing more than others, and it's not like she betrays the Precure squad once they start trying to be friendly with her. At that point in the season, there's a little handful of magic gemstones that everyone's trying to collect up, and when they're in front of her, there's this implication of a covetous power that comes over Regina and makes her want to take them for herself. Given that she's been displayed as a pretty selfish person and is on the villain's side, this doesn't seem out of place and has this angle of her sort of fighting against her own nature, which could be representative of the inner struggle that being a good person can sometimes take. However, by the culmination of that segment of the story, Regina has turned against the selfish king, her own father, in order to do what's right, which also feels like her planting her feet in her new position. Not immune to wavering, but now pretty grounded and set. So when she ends up getting snatched up by the villains on a beach trip and brainwashed into being on their side again, while a new Precure comes out of literally nowhere to fill the 6th Ranger slot, it does kind of feel like the show is trying to make you feel stupid for getting invested in Regina's growth and development in the first place, because it backslides so much in an instant. And once again, we return to the issue of brainwashing and Precure. I've made my position pretty clear on this in quite a few videos at this point. I've also been warned it's something that's going to come up a few times more, which I'm not thrilled about, but I guess I'll just have to live with it. The long and the short of it is that brainwashing deprives characters of making meaningful choices and having agency in their own actions, making story choices around these things feel cheap and unearned. It's a convenient and somewhat lazy way to make a character make choices they otherwise wouldn't in order to get around having to actually write them to that point that the choice would make sense for them. And the worst part is that there is room in the story to do this sort of thing without having to brainwash Regina into hating her new friends. The big bad of the season is her father. Betraying him once already was something that seemed like a pretty big struggle for her. If the angle had been taken that Regina loved her friends but still also loved her dad and ended up floating back towards him because of that, I would understand, as I think many of us would. Would it perhaps feel a little wishy-washy of her, given the way she'd recently stood up to him? Maybe, but playing around with the guilt she feels over that could have made a big difference. Having Regina just get brainwashed and shunted off to the side, though, feels like having the rug pulled out from under you without warning. Subversion of expectations is a strategy that can be used when telling a story to great effect, but it is a risky tactic, because without the proper setup and build-up, it's possible for the subversion just to end up leaving your audience feeling cheated. Regina doesn't turn around because she ends up valuing family ties more than expected. She turns around because the writers decided they didn't want to have her redeemed yet, despite the way that Regina feeling more strongly about family ties could have actually eventually have really worked for the narrative that they were going for. From a little digging in interviews in one of the art books, it sounds like this was avoided because villains becoming cures had become a bit of a recurring trend, and they wanted to avoid falling into that again. While I can understand this, if that was the plan, it should have been more carefully considered. Laying all this groundwork just leads to disappointment when it's not followed through on. If some of your audience looks at the clues you're giving them and predicts what they point to accurately, that's not a bad thing. It just means that some of your audience is capable of reading foreshadowing. Either way, Regina is taken away and we are given Augury in her place to fill the slot of the mid-season addition to the cast. And Augury taking that position just kind of makes the loss of Regina feel worse because she comes out of literally nowhere in order to fill that role, making her addition feel abrupt compared to Regina, who felt like she was slowly earning the slot. This is compounded by the way that when she first shows up, Augury is a supremely irritating character. You have Mana facing the biggest betrayal she's ever had, a girl who she was becoming very close with telling her outright that she hates her out of what feels like nowhere, and having a pretty understandable mild breakdown as a result. Augury just judges this as unacceptable, not even giving Mana 5 minutes to process what's happened. She then proceeds to take her transformation trinket and run off with it, rendering herself as the arbiter of if Mana is allowed to be a precure. The problem with this is when this has happened, Augury has, to the audience, been a precure for all of a handful of minutes. Without some kind of justification showing her as having more experience, the presumptiveness that she knows best just comes off as full of herself and not actually helpful. That interaction leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth right off the bat, which is a bit of a problem when you're bringing this character in as a subversion of expectations. Regina was a really likable character despite her flaws, so to bring in Augury to slot into the position that Regina felt like she was poised to have, while having her first interaction with the rest of the cast be a moment where she is asserting her superiority to them in a way that, frankly, comes off as a little condescending, puts Augury in a position where she is not endeared to the audience. Augury's entrance is set up in a manner where developing audience affection for her is going to be an uphill battle. This isn't helped by the way that she came out of literally nowhere. She was not shown or even implied by this point. This ends up putting me on the back foot where a character I enjoyed was essentially usurped by a character I don't know anything about. I can see a future where this development worked, but in order to do that, she would have needed to be introduced earlier in the season and shown a little bit. Essentially, she would have needed to be like Akko, a side character we see a handful of times before she gains more plot relevance. The lack of setup is a really strong contributing factor to how her introduction goes so poorly. The problems don't stop just after her introduction, though. Augury proceeds to spend the next several episodes being a really hard-nosed character, while not having any reason to, at least in the eyes of the audience. Despite the fact that she has not been helping in the past, she immediately appoints herself as a sort of drill master for the rest of the group, something that, until that point, they didn't really seem to need. Yes, the challenges are getting harder to overcome, but they are still overcoming them, and it visibly just damages teen morale to have an elementary school child yapping at them about how they are doing everything wrong. Oh yeah, forgot to mention, Augury is even more of a child than the rest of the group, something that only undermines her further when she tries to talk from a place of authority and experience. Augury ends up being pretty insufferable for the first several episodes after she's introduced, which does not help with the uphill battle she is already fighting to be a character that slots well into the group. While she does eventually mellow out after a bonding trip with everyone and the reasons for her attitude being revealed, you'll have already formed an impression of her based off what you've seen following her initial appearance, one that likely isn't going to change much. Once Augury mellows out, she is a plenty fine character, and it's revealed she has some self-doubt that makes for some nice character work. Her struggles are relatable, well, outside of the magically induced ones, that is, but because of that initial impression, it can be hard to see and remember that because her initial characterization sticks out more in your mind. First impressions can be lasting, and in a case like this, can prove especially devastating. This is also exacerbated even more by two things that happen to the series when she shows up. Firstly, Regina is taken away from us. I know I already mentioned that, but to be more clear, Regina is taken away as a friend and then proceeds to not show up at all for an extended period of time that she's being kept in a stasis bubble, effectively removing her completely from the series. She is taken away in episode 23 and does not return until episode 37, a 14 episode stretch where she is just absent from the series, not really helping the impression that Augury is meant to be there to replace her. The other issue is that 14 episode stretch is a complete slog. It's like the forward pace of the season, which we'll talk more about later, just screeches to a halt, providing us with episodes that are mostly either bad or banal. Both of these things happening at the same time does not help these characters. Eventually, they are brought back into the series together for the big reveal that Regina and Augury are both one half of the Princess of the Magic Kingdom, born when she split her heart in two. This was all because the big bad of the season is actually her father. We'll get to it. And she was torn between two options: selflessly doing the right thing and destroying him, or selfishly wanting to avoid doing that because he is her father, sealing him instead, even though she knows that it won't last. It is unfortunate that the show visually shows us this moment of the princess splitting her heart in half, with one half looking pink like it's meant to, and the other looking black like hearts are when they're corrupted by the villains of the season, because it gives this visual implication that she is splitting her heart into good and evil halves, which isn't really what's happening here. It would be more accurate to say she's splitting her heart between the half that loves her father and the half that loves her kingdom, because she is unable to make herself choose. You can see this in the way that Augury doesn't really care what means she has to take to defeat the villains and what state it will leave them in if it means she can save the kingdom, while Regina does display a strong attachment to her father at pretty much every point in the series, which, when taking this backstory into account, does leave room for the idea of Regina betraying everyone because of her love for her father, because that's literally what she was formed from. So while learning this does open up a nice dimension for her character, it also makes the situation of her getting brainwashed earlier in the season even more frustrating in hindsight. Unfortunately, I do think, despite it not really being the intention to make Augury and Regina a good twin, evil twin situation, too much of the visual language and characterization tends to lean in that direction. Regina and Augury are kind of designed as a mirrored set: brown hair versus blonde, pulled back bangs with an understated hair accessory versus loose hair with an overstated one. Much of Regina's time on the show is focused on making her a better person, making her good. It's hard to escape the implication that she is the evil half when she's dressing in black and spending all her time with the villains. It's not the way that I see it, but I can see that that's likely what she gets simplified down to for some people. That is something that's going to cause a problem for Augury too. If you see her as the good half, then every time she has a character flaw, you are asking why, and why she barely gets called out on them. I do think the way the rest of the group has a tendency not to stand up to her is a bit of a problem, since it's not fun to watch the cast cower before an elementary schooler. It kind of looks like the reason they listened to her is because she had a big display of power when she showed up. But that's a bit of a problem when she is so immediately detrimental to group cohesion. Both these characters had a decently strong core to them that I think could have worked if they were properly handled, but they were unfortunately so intertwined with each other and handled so poorly that there was never really a chance for them to work. Out of the two, Regina does end up coming off better, but that's mostly because she was already the more likable of the two, and her problems lie more with pacing and structure rather than her being a grating character. Doki Doki did have a bit of a return to something I had found pretty lacking recently: a supporting cast. The last couple of seasons had been pretty insular, with the characters not really interacting with terribly many other characters outside of their obligatory fairies, the villains, and maybe one or two other characters. While this isn't the most robust supporting cast the series has ever had, it's definitely better than the last couple of seasons. For example, each of the girls from Earth has some kind of visible and unique home life that we can understand the dynamics of, compared to having just obligatory parent characters that are shown once and then never again. Mana lives in a multi-generational household that is attached to the family business. Both her parents are around pretty consistently, and she also has her grandfather living with them. Her father and grandfather also have a bit of a playful bickering dynamic going on. Rika is an only child to two parents who are both very busy. Her mother is a doctor, meaning that she's not home often because she works long hours, leaving Rika pretty independent day to day, while her father is a traveling photographer and spends most of his time out of the country, though he often sends gifts from his travels to let her know he's still thinking about her even when he's far away. Alice has two very busy parents that aren't around very much, but both of them are consistently gone rather than just one. Her mother is an opera singer, while her father is a big-time CEO, who, as we have discussed, is very, very rich, so both of them are really busy. However, Alice consistently has a butler watching over her, so she isn't really left alone in the same way that Rika is. We are also shown that her father is incredibly overprotective of her. While not really an Earth girl, Augury is shown to be living with her grandmother. Even though they aren't really actually related, there's a lot of love there. Their interesting family dynamic is also complicated by the fact that Augury is technically only a year old, and thus has only been living in this situation for that year. Parents in Precure are often not shown very much, mostly because having your parents paying a close attention to you means you have less ease slipping away for magical adventures. Usually it ends up being just one character has a pretty consistent presence of their family, and the others will maybe mention them or have them shown once, but they won't be around all that much in the actual show. However, this season, all the families are around a lot more. In the case of Alice, it's more her butler being there than her parents, but he is her consistent adult, so I'm counting him. I think this is the most that the parents have been around since Fresh, which is interesting because this is also the only series along with Fresh where families end up finding out what their kids have been up to, though it's much later here and far less direct. The families do make up the bulk of the side cast, since the classmates of the girls don't tend to play that much of a role in this show aside from one or two that are recurring. The rest tend to be one-off occurrences at most. Outside the families, the other recurring adult figure in the lives of the girls is Joe, or Jonathan. I admit he comes off a bit sketchy at first, and I can see that the show is going for that kind of mysterious figure from another world with him. However, he just ends up coming off as kind of weird. Thankfully, the show recognizes this, and it's kind of played for a joke early in the season, treating him as a suspicious person that the girls aren't sure what his deal is until things end up getting more explained. He's mostly just there to give each of them the little trinket they need to eventually transform and be another person who can explain magic things along with Makoto. He does eventually come in clutch a few moments where he fights alongside the girls, but after that point he just ends up going off and protecting the princess trapped in a crystal that's not actually the princess, but he doesn't know that yet. This sequesters him in hiding for a decent portion of the season, meaning he isn't actually around all that much and affecting the plot after a while. He just kind of vanishes. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. He probably would have just been extraneous at that point anyway. His biggest contribution to the plot is being another person who knew the princess. He was, allegedly, her fiancé, so he has an emotional stake in everything that's going on with her. As a result, he ends up being a kind of tragic figure because the princess never comes back. She's not able to because each of the halves of her heart that were separated grew into their own full hearts by having experiences in the world as Regina and Augury. And he takes that shockingly well, but also the narrative doesn't really give him a chance to dwell and reflect on that because of when the reveal happens in the season. Also, I don't think the writers cared to go into his feelings all that much. And I will say I am incredibly thankful that the writers did not make some kind of joke about him waiting until one of the girls grew up enough to replace his love. He just accepts it and moves on, even if framed as a joke that would have left a bad taste in my mouth about him. And of course, we have to talk about the fairies. So this season saw fit to do that thing where every girl has an assigned fairy because the fairies are the transformation item, which in its defense, they have not done for a while now. The downsides are that this leads to an overabundance of extra fairy characters. Early in the season, it became pretty hard to tell them apart, and I was mostly referring to them in my notes as pink mascot or blue mascot, you know. The pink, blue, and yellow ones are all very little sibling coded, let's say. There's not that much personality-wise different between them. They're all pretty nice. They all want to be helpful. The most difference you're going to get between them is how those personality traits manifest in an individual episode that might focus on them. For example, one gets a crush on a human girl, and another wants to help so bad she loses track of how long she has stayed in human form, leading to a minor complication in an episode's fight. I can't say that I liked or disliked any of them. They're mostly just there and around the whole time, occasionally cute, but not much else. There's just not a lot of room for them to get much spotlight because there are so many of them. One of their major functional purposes outside of being a transformation item is the way that they don't know much about the world, so they can have things explained to them, and by proxy, the children in the audience. The exception to this is the purple one, Dobby. She's depicted as older and more of an adult than the rest of the group, represented by the way she has a more adult-looking human form and speaks and acts with more maturity. She also doesn't get a whole lot of focus, but having her as Makoto's manager does give her a more visual place in an episode and allows her to act as an adult in charge of the girls if needed. Of the four of them, she ends up being my favorite, but that's mostly because she's the most adult and least childish, which I tend to prefer as someone who isn't really into the whole mascot shenanigans side of things. Also, she can drive, which is new for mascots, and that's fun. And the last person I have to talk about is my least favorite element of the season. Halfway between human and fairy, Ai is the baby character that shows up about 8 episodes in when she hatches from an egg and imprints on the Precure girls. She is mentioned to be another piece of the princess, likely her body, magically transformed and repurposed after her heart was pulled out and split-seed. And she is a baby with wings. So if you go back to my video on Fresh Precure, I spent a little bit of it talking about how I do not care for putting a baby character in these shows. Firstly, baby characters tend to be more annoying than childish mascots, but my bigger issue is I do not like seeing middle school girls have to play the role of mom. I don't like seeing them forced into that position by circumstance or plot or whatever else has contrived to give them a child. It makes me uncomfortable because no child that age should be taking on that role. I understand that within the context of the show and all that, this is another thing that is a form of play, but it's not the case for characters in universe, which is why it bothers me. Ai is handled both better and worse than Chiffon at the same time. As for what is done better, we have the mere existence of Joe. In Fresh, the girls had to do literally all the care for their magical baby because she looked like a teddy bear, so no adult could find out and help. This time around, Joe is a character that the girls can pretty readily leave their magical baby with and watch her for extended periods of time. This does alleviate a good amount of time spent in the mom role early in the season, and we mostly just see the girls playing with Ai more than anything else, like she was the child of a family friend or a little sibling. Ai also has some capability to bend reality and manipulate the minds of those around her, so she can basically get herself whatever care she needs. At one point, Mana's mom thought she was Mana's little sister, for example. That said, the girls are explicitly referred to as her mother more than once, which is just uncomfortable and I don't like. Joe also disappears for a while Ai is still around, meaning the cast still have to take care of her. As for what is worse, this does put them into the role of raising Ai more. There is more of an emphasis on the way that their behavior and actions ends up teaching Ai. It makes these girls have to be good role models for her, which leads to a stretch of episodes that are some of my least favorite that I've seen. It's the same plot formula over and over. One of the girls has something she doesn't want to do, Ai picks up on that and starts replicating the behavior. The girls have to show Ai that they actually have to do this thing and everyone grows up through it. It's fine as an episode conceit, however as an adult I get nothing out of an episode telling me that I need to eat my vegetables and brush my teeth. Yeah, it's that on the nose. We've already talked about Regina, so we might as well get to talking about the rest of the cast that make up the villains this season. I'm going to be real with you, most of them were personally pretty forgettable to me. It's not like they were awful or anything, they just didn't stand out as much as some others, and I think that comes down to two things. Firstly, they are just completely overshadowed by Regina once she shows up. She is such a show stealer that it can feel like the rest that are around at the same time as her are just fighting for screen time. The other factor was the way that their designs are pretty subdued compared to the last handful of seasons, giving them a more mellow look that really didn't stand out in my mind long term. Looking to the root of what each of their names is speculated to have derived from, it seems that there was some naming convention that was trying to do something with the idea of the 7 deadly sins, and this was also confirmed in an interview. However, I don't think it extends much beyond that. Sure, I could cherry pick little moments that connect up if you squint at them just right, but a one-off moment in one episode does not a character theme make. It's a case where I can see what they were going for with many of these, but I think the implementation was too light to fully come across. And it definitely would have gone over the head of most kids, I'm sure. Bella, Ira, and Marmo make up a trio that are there from the start of the series, and they're alright. Their main issue is they're not particularly stand out on their own and are more compelling when they're hanging out with each other and you get to see them throw little jabs and jibes back and forth. The whole idea is that they are each an embodiment of selfishness, and that's something that is demonstrated better when they are interacting or bickering. The differences between them feel more like they're for flavor than anything else. Each of them does get a bit of a spotlight moment, which is something to be appreciated. For Marmo, it was an episode where she gained the temporary ability to transform into a hero, and then used that to set up her own situations that she could save people from to take credit. It's a fun little episode. For Ira, it was an implied crush on Rika, solidified by an episode where she takes care of him while he has amnesia. I can see the chemistry there, and they are pretty dang cute. And with Belle, it wasn't really a focal episode, but more that he was clearly in charge of the three of them, given solid moments of bossing the other characters around, and giving himself over to be host to a primordial evil at the very end of the series. I like these three when we see them hanging out in their bowling alley themed lair. I just often found them to be underwhelming when they went out solo to fight the Precure is all. Leva and Gula come in after Regina has been whisked away. I've already mentioned how the episodes after that are a bit of a slog, and these two are definitely one of the contributing factors to that. From the moment they show up, they essentially assume primary villain duties in place of the trio we've had up to that point. Even if I wasn't enamored with the other villains, they did swap out regularly for some varieties. But when these two show up, it's always the two of them on attack, rendering them pretty repetitive. Gula doesn't have a terribly strong personality. Oh, big character likes eating? Groundbreaking. Leva, on the other hand, I have a bit of a problem with him, but that's a discussion that would be better served in a different section of this video, so we'll come back around to him a bit later, if you don't mind. These two serve primary antagonist spot for a while before Belle turns them into a pair of rings that he forces on Ira and Marmo, removing them from the story and bringing attention back to the trio of villains again. The handling makes it feel like he could have done this all along, leaving their section of the season feeling like it's buying time to make the whole season last longer, which ends up reflecting poorly on them, unfortunately. And, of course, we have the final big bad of the season, the Selfish King, a name as well as a fitting descriptor given everything that led up to him being in that position. You see, this guy is actually the king of the Magic Kingdom of the season and the princess's father prior to the start of the series. But when the princess gets sick, he makes use of a magic crown that's one of 3 legendary artifacts to gain the knowledge he needs in order to save his daughter. He does this even though he knows the crown is acting as a seal on a sort of primordial force that an ancient iteration of the Precure sealed away. This is, when viewed objectively, a selfish action. Breaking the seal to save the life of one person ends up releasing an evil that will hurt far, far more. Yet at the same time, can any of us say that we wouldn't have done something similar to save the life of someone close to us? We all have people we would move heaven and earth for, people who are the ones that we would put above the lives of strangers. Sure, we like to think we wouldn't be able to make that choice or that we would be objective, but when these pesky things called feelings get in the way, things can turn out differently. I love this little backstory because it allows for the king to be invaded by a corrupting force for a reason that is just so real and human that you can't help but sympathize. He's even aware of just how selfish what he has done is, but he doesn't care because his daughter matters more to him. Through this, that primordial force of selfishness is able to consume and overtake him, serving as the real big bad. It just needs someone who had a little crack in them in order to invade. It allows us to have this good person that we want to save without running into that issue of brainwashing because he is a combination force and not just the king turned completely on heel. For all that good, though, He is just kind of functionally another big shadowy figure off in the distance, something Precure does a lot and doesn't manage to make all that interesting usually. He issues an order now and then, but for the most part he is forgettable until he comes into the spotlight at the end of the season and his backstory is put on full display. That primordial force, the proto-selfishness, doesn't get to spend much time in the spotlight at all. It combines with Bell for a single episode and that's it. Not really much to say here. It's honestly just convention that the big bad this season will end up less interesting than those under him. There's only been 1 or 2 times where that's not the case, so I can't exactly be mad when it happens again, though I can wish that maybe next time they'll do something a little more interesting. Never thought we'd be talking about season structure again so soon, but here we are, because this season is the polar opposite to Smile. While Smile was the most episodic that Precure had ever been, Doki Doki leans in the opposite direction to be more serialized than a season has ever been. And to be fair, this still isn't a season that is 100% serialized, just a little more than most before. The season does have portions that are pretty episodic, but it also does have a higher quantity of cliffhangers than is usual for the franchise. Because it's not as though Precure has never had serialization. There's some level of it in every season. Even when we basically set the premise and then just use that as a jumping off point for multiple episodes, there is still a sense of continuity in every season. There are power-ups gained, characters developed, MacGuffins collected, and in some cases rises and falls of minor antagonists. Precure has never been a series that resets to the same status quo between episodes. Characters carry what they learn or the ways they grow up from one episode to the next. Doki Doki is just more willing to put the starting plot beat of the next episode into the end of the one that comes before it. This leads to a lot of cliffhangers. Many of these are resolved pretty quickly in the episode that they follow, serving as just a bit of bait to either keep you watching or get you to tune in next week. And as cheap as that might sound, you can't deny that it's very effective. It gives the early portion of the season a lot of forward momentum since it gives this feeling that things are flowing from one episode to the next, which this season kind of needs, because when you take a step back, for a while there it is pretty unclear what the goal is outside of just stopping the bad guys whenever they show up. There is some lip service that we need to stop the bad guys because they're gathering some nebulous energy that will cause the big bad to revive if they can get enough of it, so it is a progress slowing measure to fight back against them. However, outside of that, for a while it is unclear what exactly everyone is trying to do that will actually help the situation in the Magic Kingdom. The goal is at first getting the team together, including getting Makoto to trust them, which happens far quicker than you might have expected given Makoto's early aloof nature. Then it moves into trying to find the princess, at which point you can feel the episodes bending over backward to justify how their fun time activities might help. Well, the princess liked doing Thing, so maybe if we do Thing, that will help find her in the same way that Makoto being a pop idol will. There's not really any reason to think it actually will, but it's a justification to get everyone somewhere or doing an activity. This is peppered with things like everyone taking a trip to the ruined kingdom to see what they're fighting for, and some personal growth and all that. But after a while, you do start to notice there doesn't seem to be anything that the girls are able to actively do in order to make progress, except the extremely nebulous idea of finding the princess. At that point, the royal crystals get introduced, 5 things to collect over the next handful of episodes in the hopes that it might aid their progress. This combines with the new introduction of trying to make friends with Regina to kickstart the momentum forward again. Progress continues until they find the princess, but not actually the princess, but they don't know that yet, crystal, lose Regina, and gain augury. At which point, the momentum just slams into a wall. I talked about this earlier when talking about Augury's introduction, but the segment of episodes after she's brought into the fold really end up dragging. You have the part where she's trying to be a drill sergeant to make them better, which is frustrating to watch, and doesn't actually feel like any sort of real progression of the plot. Which, in most seasons, it would be fine for us to slow things down and have some episodic stories after a big mid-season moment, but given the general flow that this season had going, this is a pretty big disruption of that, which feels like all the momentum and pacing has been kneecapped. Things start to feel like they're getting back on track when everyone takes off on an island adventure to go and get a magic mirror that might help them. Okay, 3 artifacts that we need to collect. Excellent, a new goal has been established. Only for the show to run the pacing into a wall as we get what I like to call the I hits the terrible twos arc. This is a stretch of episodes where the girls have to play mom more than ever and be a good role model to I by doing things like eating their carrots and brushing their teeth. This doesn't last very long, but going into these sorts of episodes after having recently gotten a new proper goal for the first time just feels like the flow has once again been disrupted. It almost feels like the show is trying to stall for time so that the goal isn't completed until exactly when it needs to be in the season, but instead of some kind of plot relevant roadblock, it reverts to the Precure standby of episodic fun. And don't get me wrong, episodic fun is good and all, but when the season had a nice flow early on, seeing it all but completely fall apart after the halfway mark is disappointing. It's almost like they ended up getting cagey with how much serialization was happening and sharply pulled back on it. If it was like a 3 episode gap, this wouldn't really stand out. But with the first artifact being the goal in episode 30 and the second not being approached until 39, it feels like there wasn't any forward movement for all those episodes. It stands out even more because after 39, the series really feels like it gets back on track. There are 2 episodes sort of dealing with the fallout of the failure to get the second artifact, which then moves into figuring out exactly what the deal with Augury's past is, which then moves us into the endgame of the season pretty smoothly. I like that the season was willing to experiment with how it paced its story across episodes, but this experiment, like many often do, ended up getting a little messy, and that's fine. What's here is still pretty serviceable. It's some episodes that drag, not the entire collapse of a plot in on itself. In the grand scheme of writing sins, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just something that, if they were going to give it another try, needs to be further refined. However, as far as I'm aware, this isn't something that really seems to happen again, and the series falls back into that semi-serialized nature that it's always had. I'd love to see them try and refine this form of Precure more, but I guess that's a bit much to hope for from a weekend morning cartoon. As is normal for Precure at this point, the fight animation continues to go hard most of the time. Battles this season feel like they're nice and impactful. There were some that maybe went by a little fast, but that's not terribly uncommon for this series if we're being honest. For the most part, if there was a fight happening, I was having a pretty good time. Even with the general repetitiveness of the stock footage, there was at least a little variation in how things might go given the way the characters had mildly different effects here and there. Rika's attacks, for example, would freeze enemies a little even if they didn't outright defeat them, which made it feel like she was being a little tactical even if that wasn't always the case in practice. Alice's shield got a lot of unique utility and was used perhaps the most creatively that we've ever had a shielding character do something like that. It didn't happen every single episode, but it happened often enough that it felt like it was part of her fighting style rather than just an incidental event here and there. One of the things I think the season struggled to show was the growth that everyone was having after the mid-season introduction of Augury, though. So there's this stretch in the middle of the season where Augury is playing drill sergeant to try and toughen up the rest of the girls because she wants them to be able to go and get the mirror artifact with her since she's not strong enough to do it on her own. That's all well and good, but it leads to her doing things like chewing out Alice for her shield not being strong enough when it's unclear how Alice is supposed to change or improve that at all. And I know Augury is a child and might have some childish logic here and there, but nobody pushes back on her for this or questions it. So I'm left a little confused on how one can improve a magic thing like that when there's not really any defined magic system that would explain how. We've had Precure girls do little attempts at training themselves in the past, but that's never been anything that produced or was expected to produce any real results. So when they didn't, that wasn't a problem. This was a case where results are expected by characters and there's no clear sign or path to how those are meant to happen. And the weird thing is, the girls do end up powering up, but it's something that ends up not feeling very tangible. There is a moment for each of the following episodes where they seem to end up getting some sort of boost or reaching a new level of power with a bit of a glow around them. That's not anything new for Precure as a way to display that the girls are powered up, but when Precure does this, it's not usually a recurring powered up state or an upgrade of some kind. It's usually a heat of the moment thing where hot-blooded feelings really get that magic pumping and sends them to another level of power for just a little bit. That's not to say it can't be a more solidly permanent power-up for the cast, but that's not what the franchise as a whole has really conditioned me to see this as. Even just last season in Smile, this was something that the girls got only at the very end of the season, and when it was used the second time, it was in the heat of the final battle and felt more like they were tapping into those feelings again instead of activating a power-up. So when it happens here, it's hard to see it as a power-up in evolution rather than just a one-off moment, but as far as I can tell, it's meant to be them sort of unlocking themselves and reaching a new level of strength. Like, it's not going to be visually called back to with the aura, but each of them are meant to be somewhat stronger now, and that's fine, but it can be a little hard to tell that's what the show is going for when it really only has a tangible effect for one of them. Alice gains the capability for her shield to reflect rather than just block, which is a cool sign of her evolving, but for the rest of them, it can be hard to tell just how they've grown and evolved as combatants. And that's because this sort of nebulous idea that characters have gotten physically stronger is hard to show in a show like this. Our heroes get stronger, sure, but so do the monsters, leaving them pretty evenly matched in order to keep up a sense of tension. Because it's not really fun if our leads power up and then take out enemies in a snap. We want to have that back and forth, the push and pull, that gives us the idea that even if genre convention tells us the heroes are likely to win, there's still that little chance that they might not, or that it's going to be a close shave for the drama of it all. That's why more physical signs of an upgrade, such as new attacks and weapons or forms, are pretty commonplace. It's a visual signifier of a different level of power from the norm. It's all well and good to say that someone is stronger now, but there needs to be a way to show it, and something new and shiny like that is a quick and effective way to do that, especially when the audience is children. So when we're being told the crew has grown in strength, it can be hard to get a sense of that when Alice is the only one who's really displaying a new capability. It doesn't have to be anything drastic, but the way that these characters can utilize their capabilities in order to do something they weren't able to do before is exciting. When we are adding one of those little things for extra growth on, it doesn't always have to be one of those full upgrades. The simple discovery that there is a new way to utilize what they already have can show that growth just as much, perhaps even more, if it's just them figuring out on their own. This season is also another where we have one big special attack that's a solution to every problem, which I get why. It's big, it's flashy, it's exciting, kids love it. I'll just always stand on the fact that not using the big attack every time makes it more special when you do pull it out. And I will admit, I am not a fan of the later season attack where you have the other four literally saying they're sending their power to Mana for her to then fire it off at the anime. This season does indeed put her in a position of getting more attention already, and this increased importance without any seeming reason for it can be a point of frustration. Part of the appeal of big group finishers like this is the way that it's everyone working together to overcome a challenge. That doesn't feel as impactful when it's more everyone channeling their power through one other person rather than attacking altogether. This is something I definitely would have adjusted if it were me. This time the seasonal movie is Doki Doki Precure. Mana is getting married, the dress of hope that connects to the future, and I would say it's one of the better standalones, if you like Mana. Like many of the movies, it has chosen one character to focus in on more than the others, and here that character is Mana. So if you're already someone who doesn't care for her, this isn't really going to change your mind. As someone pretty neutral on her though, I had a decent time. Before talking about the movie itself, we do have to talk about the Miracle Light intro, since this had one. The Precure girls are actually the ones who do the introducing, which is a bit of a rarity, but fun to see. Everything is gone over quickly with light humor, but not drawing out jokes to eat up time. It's over in just around a minute, getting us moving into what we actually came for. And there's even a moment where they tell you that if you don't have a light, you should just cheer with your heart, which is sweet. Solid A experience. What's funny to me is that the title of this movie isn't really representative of the content in it. Sure, there's a little talk of weddings and there's a plot significant wedding dress, but the whole Mana's getting married bit is little more than a dream sequence over the opening credits and a little trip to the future late in the movie. It's not really anything all that significant as an actual plot point in the film. The whole thing is really more about memories, about losing people and holding on to the memory of them, how it can be hard to move forward with loss, but staying stuck in the past isn't a proper solution either. The movie kind of waffles around a bit before it gets there, though. At first, it seems like it's looking into the idea of forgotten items that still have some use in them and how we tend to overlook those, but that just ends up being more of a starting hook to get into the girls trapped in movies made of their own memories for most of the runtime. I wish we could have gotten a closer look at the memory movies for Makoto, Rika, and Alice, but most of what we see from them is surface level since the movie is more invested in building out the world of Mana's memories. And to be clear, even though I would have liked to see more from the others, investing in that for Mana was the right call. Her connection to both her grandmother and her childhood dog sort of form the emotional core of the movie, and you really need to believe in that for the movie to function and have a chance at hitting you where it hurts. For me, it didn't end up hurting all that much. Not really, mostly because I wasn't terribly invested in what was going on and was just kind of on a fun ride with the whole thing. Honestly, I was more giggling at the fact that by the end of this movie, Mana has had to experience her childhood dog dying 3 separate times. Like, ouch, obviously, but kind of funny in an overkill sort of way. It's also just kind of funny that the main villain is an evil clarinet. The worst part of the movie, though, is hands down Augury's inclusion. It's not even that she's annoying to watch or has bad moments, but more that she's pretty obviously just sort of crowbarred into the whole thing. Like they forgot to include her and then had to hastily figure out how when the movie was already half completed. I know she has that limitation where she's only supposed to be able to transform for a few minutes at a time, but the way that she's just not in this movie at all outside of a few shots in Mana's dream sequence until she appears over halfway through to help out with the fighting really feels like it was something they didn't want to write around, so they just acted like she wasn't there until they needed her to be. And she just appears with no explanation of where she's been or how she got there. At least we got to see the mascots go on a wingsuit skydive to get onto the ship, but sure, Augury just got there somehow. Okay. The other really lazy part with her is that, well, she literally turns to the audience, breaks the fourth wall, and basically says, "It's time to use your plastic light now, children." Now, these miracle light bits are always a little fourth wall breaky, and I will admit are usually my least favorite part of the movie because of that. As I talked about in my video on the DX trilogy, they tend to really take me out of the moment. You can see how the movie really has to end up coalescing around that point, and it kills the pace for a moment so some kids can wave a light around for a second in a movie theater. I had just mostly accepted that as part of things and tried to put it out of mind since it wasn't like it was going to change anytime soon. It was a quirk of the franchise that I'd have to roll with. However, having one of the characters just turn to the proverbial camera and say to do it felt really lazy. Most of the other movies at least try to cover this a little by having the characters talk to each other about it instead of talking to the audience. Fresh is still the one that did it best, with the implication of it being time without outright stating it. This complete breaking of the fourth wall not only felt awkward, but just out of place. Suddenly, Augury knew we were there, and an illusion was shattered. So I'm going to admit that the transformations this season didn't really stand out to me as anything all that special. They were pretty standard and functional, and that's about it. Nothing about them was really rising above. None of them had a little standout moment like those in the prior season, for example, and this is another case where they are all segmented off into their own transformation bubbles, so there's no room for any sort of fun crossover between them either. It's also a little disappointing that every time we had the split screen between everyone starting their transformation, you can very plainly see the favoritism that went towards Mana. She comes in closer to the camera and has a little extra movement in her head when she does. She also visibly has more particle effects happening than the others, and if this was a completely solo transformation, that little bit of extra flourish would be perfectly fine, good even. But that she still has that extra when in the split screen, where it can be compared to the others, makes her stand out there and draws your eye to her. In a team moment like this, it can be good to have a level playing field. Sure, Alice also comes in a little bit closer to the camera than others, but not to the same level with Mana. And Rika and Makoto seem to be pretty level and similar in the group shot, so they set the standard that Mana ends up jumping above. It's also pretty clear that it took a little while to figure out how to work Augury's transformation in with the rest, since for a while it was pretty separated out, much like we would see in early seasons with Shiny Luminous or Milky Rose. It's there and happening at the same time, but playing out after everyone else has finished. They did eventually manage to cut it in with the rest of them, but it takes a minute to get there and feel like she is naturally part of the group, even past the point where that would have had narrative significance. The mild downside to that is the way that much of Augury's transformation is cut out when she's integrated with the rest of them, because she has one of the better solo transformations that the franchise has had up to this point. The movements are bold, the poses are striking, the way that she's depicted to growing into her new body is sharp and dynamic. The way everything shows up in a blaze of fire is just beautifully composed and animated. This shot in particular, with her face ringed in flames, is nicely evocative and feels kind of badass. It's all great, even if the intro portion of playing with her transformation item takes up a little too much of the transformation's runtime. But let's get into the fashion of this season and talk about these transformations. Overall, I think I do like them, even though I wouldn't call them my favorites. However, it's nice to see a group that looks like a team without being in uniforms. The outfits aren't all the same like we saw with the last two seasons, but they're all still clearly cut from the same cloth, so to speak. There are design elements that are carried through each of them to give the impression that they're for sure a unit without having to have the base of their looks be the same, and overall, it's a set of design choices that I end up vibing with. The only one I would say I didn't care for very much is going to have to be the one that I'm ranking in 7th place, Cure Rosetta. Now, I never really cared for the yellow girlies with a few exceptions, and that's not going to change right now. This is a design where I can see the vision on some level at least. I like the shape of her dress, and I actually do like her hair as an evolution of her civilian hairstyle. However, it's the colors where everything really falls apart for me. The yellow isn't exactly my favorite shade, but what really kills it is the green accents. Yellow and green can make a good color combo, sure, but not this yellow and green. It's a weird light shade that rubs me the wrong way, and while it technically goes with this yellow somewhat, I don't like it. I wish that I could give you some color theory reason as to why I don't like it or explain it better, but I'm not an artist. I just have a passing interest in character design and not enough technical knowledge to explain what about this color is bothering me. 6th place goes to Cure Heart's Engage mode. If you can't think of what this is, I don't blame you. It's from the movie and shows up for all of like 3 minutes tops. It's not really anything special either, kind of shockingly for a special movie form. It's just Cure Heart in a pink dress that's a little wedding dress adjacent, but not completely a wedding dress. It feels less like a special power-up form and maybe one of those things where artists draw an anime character in real clothing brands for cross-promotion. 5th place goes to Cure Ace. She's the one that feels like she most departs from the style of the others, which I feel was likely intentional given the way she functions differently from them for most of the season. It does also mean that she stands out from group cohesion, though. As a standalone design, she's one I think is mostly fine, and is certainly another case where she looks better in motion than in character stills like this. Specifically, when she's standing still, her hair doesn't look as great, but it's more fun when she's in motion. The only thing I think I could say I don't really care for is the way that the dress underneath this overcoat sort of layer just looks a little too close to her civilian dress for my tastes. 4th place goes to Cure Diamond, and that's mostly just because I think she's a little boring. There's nothing bad about her, but I don't think there's anything spectacular about her either. She's just a pretty solidly average character design that serves to complement the others well. In 3rd, we have Cure Sword. This is a design that makes it feel like she was made with action in mind. She's fairly sleek compared to some of the others, but she has the asymmetrical sleeves and long ribbon on her hip, which can be used to accentuate her movements in a fight. Her hair is a little bit nonsensical, but not enough that it looks weird, and her hair accessory ties nicely with those shapes of her sleeves again to give her upper half a lot of cohesion. 2nd place is Cure Heart. Look, I will stop ranking the pink main characters highly like I'm basic when they stop making such good lead pink designs, alright? Pink and blonde makes for a good combo, so it's here again, and I continue to like it. What can I say? I am a simple woman. I actually really love that we have these dark pink slashes that go across her body, almost like a ribbon. It breaks up the design nicely and gives a commander sort of look to her, appropriate for the character that is serving as the team leader. What I like even more though is the little bits of blue accenting that are on her skirt to break it up and give it definition. It serves the purpose, but that soft faded baby blue goes really nicely with the pink, giving her some accent coloration without allowing that color to just come in and overtake the design. And that means 1st place has to go to Cure Heart in Parthenon form. It is a little disappointing that nobody else gets any sort of power-up mode this season, I agree, but if we were only going to give one character a power-up form, at least it's something that's a little more understated. Like, nobody else ends up getting one, but it's not that much of an upgrade, so it's not as big of a deal that everyone else is missing out. This is another case where the characters end up looking a little washed out compared to the regular version, but they're not washed out as much, so it doesn't bother me as much as it has with some of the others. What makes this so good is that it's just an already good design that we have now put a cloak over the top of, and I am a sucker for a good flowy cloak. As always, let's talk about the things in this show that exist purely to be turned into plastic tat. I know I say this every time, but it bears repeating just in case anyone isn't aware. I am looking at all of these items mostly through the lens of how they fit into the series. I don't actually have terribly much interest in them as the toys they were designed to be. Years down the line, the toys will be out of production and you won't be able to buy them anymore, so they need to be able to stand on their own as part of the series since the toys won't always be available. I might consider them as a toy now and then, but that's not my primary concern when looking at these items. So this time around, the transformation item is the Lovely Commune. This is one of those cases where the mascots are double timing as the transformation item, which I have to admit isn't my favorite, but it's been quite a while since we've done it, so I can't say I'm surprised that it came back. The series only played with the drama of one of the girls being unable to transform because of mascot separation once, and even then it was via the actions of the mascot. What stands out to me is that these are the most smartphone-looking items that we've had so far. While there might have been some that were definitely based on phones, and the ones in Fresh were literally made from girls' phones, this is the first time I looked at one and determined that it was specifically a smartphone. I contend that for a little kid who is looking at these things at the time this show came out, a smartphone would be a familiar object, but not something they had likely been allowed to play with, and is a case of taking the mundane and making it magical, which is always a bit of a fun time. However, at the same time, it is a sign of the way the series is moving more and more into the modern era. With how much technology has encroached into the imaginations of children, I hope that we will not allow these kinds of phones and iPads and things like that to overtake the series. This is a series that has a lot of room to spark imagination in children through play, and I would hate to see it become overrun with these sorts of specifically technological toys. I do not mind the toys veering towards a smartphone every once in a while, but I don't want to see it all the time. I will always appreciate, though, that the toy incarnations come with these swappable pieces so they're not getting parents to buy 4 different versions of the transformation item. Then we have the Cure Loveeds. These are little charm-like things that slot into the mascot transformation items to summon all sorts of stuff. These are never a type of item I pay much attention to, if I'm being honest, mostly just because there's usually so many of them that do all functionally the same thing if there are slight differences at all, which means bothering to learn the name or a specific use of any of them doesn't really matter because you're just going to see it happen on screen and then the thing has happened. They are a signifier that something magical is coming down the pipeline within the next 10 seconds. They are there very much for playing with and not because they actually contribute anything to the show story-wise, so it's hard for me to even care the tiniest amount about them. With these ones, it's not even that they're part of a MacGuffin hunt like many have been before. In past instances, it's like you collected the little charms because they would eventually serve a greater magical purpose, and having an effect in the now was just a bit of a bonus. When it comes to the ones this season, though, it's more that they appear when it's convenient for the characters to be able to do a new thing, which is a factor that downgrades any level of emotional attachment. Then we have the Love Heart Arrow. This is the weapon that becomes the standard attack partway through the season. I admit, I do like a weapon that actually looks like a weapon. Whenever magic is involved, you can end up with the most random of objects being used to do some attacks. The downside being that sometimes the weapon doesn't actually get used like a weapon. Looking at you, Go-Go, with your swords that only exist in stock footage. Here, though, the weapons are actually used like the weapon they're meant to be sometimes, though I think that might be because being a bow and arrow type thing, a ranged magic blast is just something they're suited to doing. My only real issue with them is the design. I'm not looking to sell multiple versions of the same item as a toy, but the fact that these are all the same is a little disappointing, because when you look at the thing, you can tell it was really designed to be Mana's weapon. Heart motifs are common in Precure, to be fair, but this toy looks like it matches Mana and clashes a little bit with everyone else. It also looks quite a lot like a plastic toy with the way that it doesn't even have a drawstring and has this plunger thing that pulls back. And like, I get it, these things are always going to look a little bit like they're plastic toys, but these stand out most this season of looking like these girls are just playing pretend. Then Augury, because she's a very special little girl who the show loves to give attention to, has her own transformation item, the Love Eyes palette. I don't care for this, but that's mostly because I just think it's ugly and bulky looking. Functionally, though, it makes sense that Augury would have her own separate thing, since her transformation does function a little differently than the rest of them. I'm also not bothered by the way that it is makeup themed. In fact, I think it's actually somewhat fitting. For a younger kid, the idea of putting on makeup is something that can feel like it's rather grown up and mature. Augury literally grows into an older body when she transforms. The makeup makes her grow up. That's a fun little touch. I also like that it was at least partially constructed from the gems the girls were collecting early in the season, which makes it feel like collecting those kind of unlocked Augury in a very video gamey way. She also has a unique weapon, the Love Kiss Rouge. It's a sort of combination baton and lipstick. While on one hand this does continue through the makeup theme for her items, I also don't care for this one as much. Really, I'm not seeing the thematic through line that would make everything about her makeup themed. Like, yes, I do like the aspect of makeup growing her up with her transformation item, but I'm unsure of what about her character would lead to her weapon being makeup as well. It doesn't really tie into anything else about her. Like, sure, you could argue she spends the early part of her screen time putting on a mask, which is like a layer of makeup, but given the way this is a flaw she's meant to grow out of, I doubt that's what's supposedly being reinforced by this. Functionally, this is your average magic attack item. It is able to do slightly different things by using different colors of lipstick, which is fun, but I wish we could have seen a little more versatility from that. It doesn't come up often enough for the unique aspects of the different colors to have even stuck in my mind. Then you have the upgraded attack item, the magical lovely pad. This thing is fine. The idea that it's formed from an ancient legendary item is fun, but going from the design of that legendary item to this kidified pink toy feels like a downgrade. It goes from powerful ancient artifact to cheap plastic, and that does suck some of the mystique out of it. To make things worse, using this for attack just feels less dynamic than the prior weapon. There's only so interesting you can make a plastic iPad. Even when they weren't using the bows and arrows as exactly that, they did feel more exciting than rectangle. Coming late in the season is the magical lovely harp, basically an upgraded version of the pad that allows for a different group attack. This is barely around long enough to feel like it's worth existing and could definitely have been cut without much change at all. Just give them a different trinket to do this attack instead of a whole new item. And not really magic item, but they did make merch of it, is the lovely Incom. This is Makoto's microphone headset that she uses for her concerts. It's fine, but looks too bulky for its intended function for me. Not really a magic thing though, and the show doesn't really call attention to it like it does for the other magical stuff it has going on. The most I can say is that it was there during one of Makoto's better scenes. God, I love a real-time transformation getting put into an episode. It's always so damn cool looking. Oh boy, this is a pretty damn queer season. Look at nearly any combination of the girls, and I can see a justification for shipping it. But then there are things that just kind of feel like they're almost trying to see how much they can get away with hinting before someone gets mad. A lot of this does center on Mana, which I'm sure does not help dissuade people from thinking that she's the center of the world on this show, but there are really basically three major prongs when it comes to her. The first prong would be the Mana and Makoto relationship. I start with this one because it seems, for all intents and purposes, to be pretty one-sided. Mana has an infatuation with Makoto from the start of the series, given the way that she is a big fan of her music. The way she describes these feelings and the way she reacts early on could be an indicator of being a fan, but it also leads a little in the direction of a different sort of infatuation. Mana talks about the way that her heart beats in reaction to Makoto, and making friends with her leaves Mana exceptionally overjoyed. The two of them do end up being pretty close friends as the series goes on, and this is actually something that kind of fades out as that happens. On one hand, sure, this could be indicative of the fangirling fading out as she gets to know Makoto as a person and not some idol on a pedestal, but I would argue it's because the second prong shows up, Mana's real girlfriend, Regina. I think it's pretty easy to watch this season and just kind of accept that Mana and Regina have something going on there. They're both really devoted to each other when circumstances aren't forcing them apart, and their relationship is very easy to read as being somewhat romantic. Regina talks about feeling strange since meeting Mana. The two of them share a bed while holding hands, and Regina is literally ready to throw herself into lava for Mana's sake. She even tells Mana that she loves her multiple times. Though this is done more in a friendship way than romantic feelings, it is still something you can read as romantic if you would like to. Regina once even blushes at the same time that she says this. After Regina is taken away, Mana has this experience where she keeps seeing her everywhere, something that is a generally pretty romantically coded experience. It's not hard to take a look at these two and think that there's more going on, an element of the season that is actually very sweet and forms one of Mana's strongest connections. It helps that Mana and Regina do have a genuine chemistry that is very evident on screen and bounce off of each other really well. The third prong of relationships connected with Mana is obviously Rika. I mean, Rika's mascot literally says that Rika would make a good wife for Mana at one point, something that Mana would somewhat affirm as well. Similarly, while the show does make a gag of it in episode 2, it's evident from the beginning that Mana is exceptionally open with Rika and does not like keeping anything from her. There's no doubting that Rika is very set in her role as being Mana's sort of right-hand man, and the two of them have a very strong bond because of that. There's an entire episode that's centered around the way that Rika experiences an intense jealousy when Mana starts spending more time with Makoto. While in context this is very much about friendship, the way that the episode is executed calls to mind similar sorts of episodes that focus on a similar situation with a pair that is implied to be or could be romantically involved. Additionally, there's an episode where Mana has an underclassman that takes an interest in her and asks to be her protege. This comes along with some framing that definitely implies he might have some level of crush on Mana that leads to admiration, something that we see Rika be pretty dismissive of in a way that, to me at least, comes off as a little defensive. In terms of Makoto, while I never got the distinct impression she saw Mana as anything other than a friend, there is definitely a level of admiration she has towards the princess that I think definitely dances into the realm of being in love with her. This is definitely a love that was likely unrequited, but that's not something that makes Makoto's feelings any less real. Any of the flashbacks we have of the two of them together have Makoto with this distinct sense of longing. Add in the way that Makoto seems almost jealous of Joe when she finds out that he was a secret fiancé, and there's enough there that I'm willing to call this one completely textual, even if nothing is officially confirmed. There's not much to it since she only appears in a tiny handful of episodes, but the rich girl with a rivalry with Alice, Reina, and Alice herself definitely have something going on there. We get a reveal of them having an encounter when they were kids, but there's vibes that it's something more than that. It helps that Reina has big tsundere energy. Okay, with all that out of the way, there is one more thing we have to talk about with this season and its relationship with queerness, because I think it would be pretty irresponsible for me to talk about this cute stuff for these girls and then not point out the places where the series seriously makes missteps, especially when I've not seen many people talking about this element this season, even when I went looking. So, the moment that Leva showed up, alarm bells started ringing for me, and I sat up and paid attention. Not because he was a character I was interested in, but because I had concerns regarding his character design. I was concerned and did a little digging, only to see that there was a conception by some that Leva was meant to be a sort of clown, and that's why he had makeup on. And no, I'm sorry, I don't believe that was the intention here, because Leva's design, unfortunately, actually falls more into the realm of being a gay stereotype. I think we tend to forget that different cultures have different stereotypes and that these will manifest in different ways as a result. The gay stereotypes of Japan are not going to manifest in the same way as you might be used to seeing over here in the English-speaking side of things. And I want to be clear that you should take everything I'm saying with a huge grain of salt here. I am not Japanese and don't have first-hand experience with the culture. I'm just someone with a little bit of curiosity and time on my hands. If you find first-hand sources that disagree with me, please send them my way since I would love to educate myself further, but this is just the understanding that I've been able to pull together as an outsider. So if you've been in anime circles long enough, there's a word you might have come across. I'll put it on the screen here. This has been used to refer to everything from gay men to drag queens to trans women. There have been times this has been used a bit of a catch-all to group these people together under one umbrella, which is a bit of a problem because they're all different. Now, the reason I'm not saying it is because there's a bit of an argument to be made that this term is actually a slur, and there are plenty of people who view it as such, and I'm not looking to hurt anyone in the process of talking about this. There are other stereotypical depictions that Japan has than just this sort of character, but because this is the one of relevance, this is what we're going to be focusing on here. So the hallmarks of this stereotype are a few things. More feminine mannerisms and ways of speaking, perhaps an overdramatic affect if the piece of media is going for comedy, but the core of the joke in design terms tends to come down to a character who is either trying to come off as feminine or thinks themselves to be such while actually having a very masculine appearance. So I would like to introduce you to 80s comedy character Homoda Homo. Yes, his name does have homo in there twice to essentially make his name gay. He was not great, to put it mildly. He was an offensive stereotype used for comedy, speaking in a way that was coded as feminine, sometimes with a lisp, and with the entire joke just being for people to turn to him and ask if he's gay. He's something that shouldn't have been done in the first place, but since he was, should have stayed in the past. And thankfully, when he did get dragged into the present again, making a revived appearance on Fuji TV in late 2017, it did not go over well. to the point where the president of Fuji TV ended up apologizing. If you go into the description, I'll have a few articles linked regarding the subject in context of depictions of gay men on TV in Japan that are definitely worth giving a read if you have the time. Most relevant, though, I'd like you to take a look at this character that is basically everything about the stereotype side by side with Leva and see what I'm talking about with the design. Leva, a character that is comedically overdramatic, shares some similarities. Red lips, other makeup, and a heavy 5 o'clock shadow, the difference mostly being that Leva has eyeliner and eyeshadow instead of heavily rouged cheeks and a more wild hair than slickly combed. Now, I can't say I blame anyone entirely for thinking Leva might be a clown based on the top hat and the costume he's wearing, but when compared against other characters similar to him who are displayed as being fashionable, I think it's more that Leva is a trying to be fashionable design rather than a hobo clown design. And I bring all this up because this shouldn't be here. I'm not going to outright condemn the creators or try and make some moral argument, but I am going to say I'm disappointed to see this kind of depiction make its way into Precure. Precure is a series that has young characters growing into their own as people and allows them to be themselves. It's a series that allows teenage girls to be powerful while being unabashedly feminine and doesn't mock them or treat them as lesser because of that. So to see a mocking stereotype like this thrown in there is disappointing. They can and should have done better. And I bring this up once again because it would be a failure of me to try and talk about any potential queer undertones in the girls without also bringing up where the series does fail. Because as much as we may have fun imagining the female characters of Precure being romantically interested in each other, there's not really any outright confirmation of these things, and we aren't going to see these characters be explicitly couples. Much of these intense friendships that read as romantic are derivative of Class S literature, where love between schoolgirls is a phase as part of growing up and something that is eventually left behind. Love between girls is something intense and important, but also silly and frivolous. Just practice for when they grow up. Mana can have this intensity of feeling with her friends now, but someday she will marry a faceless man. So, this was a somewhat controversial season, and I can definitely see why. Frankly, this season is a bit of a mess. It had a decently strong, if a little unfocused, start, completely derails in the middle with what might be one of the most controversial choices I have seen from the franchise thus far, moves into a segment of the season where it spins its wheels, and then gets a little back on the rails again, but not completely stably. What ends up carrying the season is the characters. If this cast was half as likable, the season would be just a complete spiral. Hey, maybe that whole bit with Regina in the middle wouldn't have been as controversial if we didn't like her so damn much. Here's the thing. This is a series that's great until it isn't. Sure, the core plot doesn't exactly have a proactive thing for the girls to strive for, but the forward momentum of the serialized pacing was able to make up for that until it didn't. Regina has a wonderful trajectory for a rather strong villain redemption story until she doesn't. The story has a lot of forward momentum until it doesn't. The thing that doesn't derail is how charming the characters are. Even the problems that I have with some of them are mostly single episode flubs rather than being something that is baked into the characters themselves. This is a season that, at the start, I wanted so badly to be good. I'd heard people rail against it before, and I wanted to be one of the people that stood up and said, this season is great actually, fuck you, fight me. But there's just a little too much mess for me to be able to wholeheartedly do that. I love the characters in personality, but not in function. I like some of the lore, but think it's messily executed. The plot twist could have been exciting, if not for the way it made such a mess of the other parts of the season. I'm not surprised that this is a season that apparently cycles between being loved and despised in equal measure. With Sweet, there were good ideas that just had lackluster execution. Here, the good and the bad are kind of woven together, inextricably intertwined, which is why, despite having a lot of problems, I also still had a lot of fun, because those good bits are woven throughout the series. There was only one portion of the season where I actually had a little bit of trouble getting through it, and at least this time it was in the middle and not the start. Even with the mess, I think this is still a season that's worth at least watching once. I've been Mel, and thank you so much for letting me info dump at you. If you enjoyed the video, please consider a like or comment or any of that stuff that appeases the algorithm. Every bit of it helps a small channel like mine. If you want to support me more directly, my Patreon is also linked down in the description, as well as those articles I mentioned earlier. Stay safe out there.